From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Kailey, Leinz, I'm Mathieu.
Tonight, the Trump tax bill's next big hurdle, the Senate. We're on the Hill this evening as the Senate reconvenes, poised to make major changes to the president's signature big, beautiful bill that narrowly passed the House.
We'll speak with our reporters and discuss what this bill could ultimately look like when North Dakota Senator, member of the Senate Banking Committee, Kevin Cramer, joins us.
Plus, a brazen drone strike deep inside Russian territory. Ukraine taking out Russian long-range bombers and leaving Moscow alarmed over their sudden vulnerability. What the escalation means for a potential ceasefire as another round of truce talks ends.
Also tonight, the expected phone call between President Trump and Chinese President Xi, as both Washington and Beijing accuse each other of violating their latest trade agreement. What it means for the long-term prospects of those much-promised trade deals.
And a horrific attack in Colorado targeting a march in support of Israeli hostages. Now the president blaming lax immigration policies for the presence of the suspect. Why? And the charges against the alleged attacker up ahead.
But we do begin with the developments from Capitol Hill, where senators are returning to town for the first time since the House passed that big, beautiful bill, as President Trump likes to call it. Now, time for them to make their mark. And joining us live from Capitol Hill, of course, as always, Bloomberg's Erik Wasson is on the scene. Erik, how many changes this legislation in for?
I think it's going to be quite significant. We caught up with Senate Majority Leader John Thune this afternoon. He said the Senate will be looking to increase the spending cuts in this bill to try to offset some of the tax cuts, as well as expanding key business tax provisions that only last for 5 years in the House bill. These are provisions that are very important: depreciation, interest expensing, and there's just a general feeling among economists and Senate Republicans that permanent tax policy that gives businesses certainty is the best way to go. Thune told us they're going to try to get this through the House and Senate by July 4th. The way they're going to do that is craft something that can pass the Senate and then just be basically rubber stamped by the House, not have a ping pong effect going back and forth that could delay the process. He also said the next 2 weeks are going to be taken up by working with the Senate Rules Keeper to see how much in the House bill, whether it's AI regulation, something called the REINS Act that basically sunsets existing regulations and it gives Congress a say in them, can make it through. There's a lot of doubts among budget experts whether they're allowed, because the Senate says anything using this special expedited budget procedure has to be budgetary in nature.
Yeah, so the parliamentarian could cause some problems here. When we think of other potential troublemakers, Erik, whose voices will be the loudest and most influential? Those who argue cuts are not going far enough, or those that argue cuts to Medicaid and other programs are going too far?
I'm starting to think that they may neutralize each other. We do have four key senators: Mike Lee, Rand Paul, Rick Scott, and Ron Johnson, who are all saying they want deeper cuts. Ron Johnson's talked about $5 trillion in cuts. There's about $1.5 trillion in cuts in the House bill. He's probably not going to get that amount, but he could put some more concrete proposals on the table and try to get them through. But one of the key places they could go is to Medicaid, which already sees the deepest cuts of any program in the House bill. But to really do that beyond the work requirements and cost sharing, such as copays that are in the House bill, you would have to really go and start limiting the federal match to the states, sort of really eroding further Obamacare's expansion of Medicaid to less poor individuals. And that's really a no-go for these moderates like the Lisa Murkowskis of Alaska of the world. Josh Hawley today tweeting that he talked to President Trump and they agreed no Medicaid benefit cuts. It's unclear what he means exactly by that. There's a sense that the president's also cognizant that a lot of his supporters may be using Medicaid to afford health care and health insurance, and it could be politically disastrous to cut it further.
All right, Bloomberg's Erik Wasson, thank you so much. And Bloomberg is just learning via spokesperson for the Senate Majority Leader John Thune. Thune met with President Trump today. To be a fly on the wall in that room. And a question, of course, as to whether the president echoed what we heard from a member of House Republican leadership earlier today. The Republican Conference Chair, Lisa McClain of Michigan, warning about possible changes the Senate could make to this bill.
I hope they don't do many changes to reduce the amount of savings, right? I think we've hit the sweet spot. I don't believe they'll make many changes to Medicaid because, again, that was a very delicate balance, and SALT is obviously very important. So I don't see a lot of changes that they really can make. We really can't have a lot of changes. It is not going to be positive for the American people if we do that. It just makes everybody's job way more difficult.
Joining us now from Capitol Hill for more is Republican Senator Kevin Cramer of North Dakota, a member of the Senate Banking Committee, live with us here on Bloomberg TV and radio. Senator, we appreciate your time. Would you be prepared to vote yes to the House bill as is? And if not, what changes do you need to see?
Well, that's a really great question. I think I start with a yes vote. I think, Kailey, that's where I begin. I want this to pass, but there's no reason that the Senate should just simply rubber stamp it when we can do so much better, in my view. I think it was interesting listening to the leader from the House say that they hope we don't, they don't think there's any way to find more savings, and I think that's really the thing we have to do. We will not be able to pass the bill without finding some more spending cuts, to Erik's point, by the way, in the piece, and I think he summarized it very, very well. And we can do that without going after Medicaid benefits, but we ought to go after some of these schemes around the country where individual states are using Medicaid to pad their own state pocketbook rather than actually providing the services. So there's things we can do. SALT, she brought up SALT. She hopes we don't reduce SALT. Well, it went from $10,000 to $40,000 of deductibility. It seems to me that anything over 10 should be something that a moderate from New York would like. So maybe we can bring it to 30 or 20. I do think, though, by and large, it will look similar to the House bill, but we just may be able to find some other places for savings and maybe make some of those tax policies permanent, by the way, that you talked about up front. I mean, the biggest piece of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act from 2017 that we need to fix is to make those tax cuts permanent. Those are pro-growth tax cuts, and if we want to make a dynamic economy even more dynamic, I think that's got to be sort of the foundation of it all. So it will look largely the same, but I think some of the numbers will change.
Mm-hmm. Of course, the parliamentarian's going to weigh in here, Senator, and I'd love to ask you about what you think survives the bird bath, which is just getting underway here. What would comply with the bird rule, if you will, when it comes to budgetary procedures that end up in a reconciliation bill? I don't know what bird droppings you see ending up on the floor here, but will the current policy baseline method of accounting that was used in the House survive the parliamentarian?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know, but I think it should, because the fact of the matter is that, to your point, it has to be budgetary. So that means it has to, any part of this bill has to either deal with revenue, i.e. taxes, up or down, or spending. The appropriations piece, up or down. And to the degree that there's some policy changes, that has to be, sort of incidental, not extraneous. So no doubt some things may not make it, and there may be some things Republicans in the Senate want that may not be able to make it. On the other hand, there might be some real opportunity there. So the parliamentarian has a lot of, final say over here. We're not likely, if ever, to overturn the parliamentarian on the bird rule. Otherwise, it would be, violating the Senate basically. I don't know what's going to make it or what's not going to make it. All I know is that the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, making those pro-growth tax policies permanent, is the first thing we ought to do, and then finding further savings in spending ought to be the other thing. One of the reasons we're doing the big bill rather than pieces of legislation is, you might recall there's a little PTSD around here from those of us that were here in 2017 when the House first passed repeal and replace of Obamacare, and it failed by one vote in the Senate. I think everyone thought if we put it all together, all of these pieces together into one big, beautiful bill, you'd get more people supporting it. At the same time, you find more things that people can be opposed to. So we'll see if the strategy even works out.
Well, of course, the strategy from this administration is also, when looking at the holistic impact on the deficit, it's one thing to consider the tax mechanism, which can be scored by the CBO, but they also argue tariffs have to be factored in, that the revenue driving force of tariffs will help offset some of these tax cuts. But you just spent time over recess on a congressional delegation to Canada trying to potentially smooth things over with Mark Carney on trade. Is it your opinion that tariffs need to be lowered with key allies like Canada, or that they should remain where they are so that you get the income?
Sure. Well, I think tariffs as a trade negotiating tool are fine, and with that in mind, I don't think every country's treated the same, because I don't think every country behaves the same. And so I do think there's some room for improvement with Canada. There might be room for improvement with other trading partners. What I worry about, and to the degree that tariffs would be considered as part of the reconciliation package, the problem with that is, while you can certainly score a tariff, if you can presume a certain amount of revenue coming from a tariff, I think that's relevant. But it's not relevant to the bill itself unless it's part of the bill. So you don't get to really score it against the reconciliation package. And that gets a little clumsy. But what really matters here is reduction of the deficit, to your point. And that's why I think you have to look at the whole of the Congress, the whole of the administration over the course of an entire Congress, 2 years, not just one bill versus another bill.
Senator, I'm sure you stopped in your tracks as a member of the Senate Armed Services Committee when you saw this attack by Ukraine against Russia over the weekend. Remarkable to see them smuggle drones into Russia and cause the amount of damage they did against the country's strategic bomber fleet. Two of your Senate colleagues, Democratic Senator Richard Blumenthal and Republican Senator Lindsey Graham, were in Ukraine over the weekend to meet with President Zelensky and had this to say about it. Bipartisan bill that you support that would impose new sanctions on Russia. Let's listen together.
The Senate and the House of Representatives in the next 2 weeks will be moving forward with a sanction bill that's bone crushing.
There are very few causes that will take 41 Republicans and 41 Democrats, put them on record on a single piece of legislation. It doesn't happen these days. The cause of Ukraine is doing it.
Senator, there are great questions about whether Russia will strike back and how. What would make these sanctions different than prior rounds?
Yeah, so these sanctions are bone-crushing, to Lindsey's point, because they go after not just Russia. It's not just primary sanctions on, say, Russian banks or Russian oil, but secondary sanctions on those that would do business with Russia. And when when other countries are forced with the binary choice of, gee, do we want to be a customer of or a provider or a supplier for Russia or the United States of America? Do we want to face the onslaught of American sanctions, or would we rather hang out with our buddy Vladimir Putin? And I think given those options, it would be a very bleak moment for Vladimir Putin, not just, by the way, because of the drone strikes, but the economic problems that he would be created for him. Well, first of all, he wouldn't be able to afford the war. Too many of even some of our frenemies are helping him supply cash for fighting this war. So I think they would be bone crushing. He should be concerned enough that there are 82 senators on this bill. The fact that they would pass easily, and I think it should incentivize Vladimir Putin to get to the ceasefire and get to the table. And then you throw in the drones and Ukraine's ability to do what they did is really remarkable. But the other thing, as a Senate Armed Services Committee member, that I can't help but think about is our own vulnerability as a nation. We're working on this Golden Dome to intercept and take down missiles that would come from distances far, far away. But we also have to guard ourselves against exactly what happened to Russia, lest we be watching the skies as we get attacked from within.
Could the Golden Dome, we're out of time, Senator, could the Golden Dome have stopped an attack like that with drones, as we saw?
This is why the Golden Dome has to be multi-layered. We think of a dome as just sort of looking out into outer space, looking at ballistic missiles, if you will. But no, you have to have a multi-layered from under the sea, the top of the sea, the ground, underground, and all the way up to space. Right. It has to be very, very many, many layers. And I'm not sure we're as prepared as we need to be.
Let's talk more about that next time you join us. Republican Senator Kevin Cramer of North Dakota. We thank you, sir, for being here on Bloomberg. Some Republican lawmakers have been facing tough crowds, as we've told you, during local town halls because of the proposed cuts in the tax bill we were discussing with the senator. One of those lawmakers, Republican Senator Joni Ernst of Iowa, at an event last week was asked about the impact of these proposed Medicaid cuts. It went viral. Here's what she had to say to critics in the follow-up response.
People are not, well, we all are going to die. So, for heaven's sakes, folks.
I was in the process of answering a question that had been asked by an audience member when a woman who was extremely distraught screamed out from the back corner of the auditorium, "People are going to die." And I made an incorrect assumption that everyone in the auditorium understood that, yes, we are all going to perish from this earth.
Bleak. For more, we turn now to another lawmaker from Iowa who held her own town hall, by the way, during the recess over the holiday. Republican Congresswoman Ashley Hinson of Iowa, member of the Appropriations Committee, the House China Select Committee, is back with us on Bloomberg. Congresswoman, welcome. It's good to see you. Did your senator just make a political mess for you, or did Joni Ernst put this story to rest in that graveyard?
Well, thank you, Joe, for having me. First and foremost, I can tell you that the Democrats' fear-mongering is the real problem here about Medicaid. They're out there continuing to lie about what's in the big, beautiful bill. And so I actually really enjoyed the opportunity to get out in my district and do 2 in-person town halls. I did one in Elkader and one in Dakota. And I will continue to do that, get out there and answer Iowans' questions, because I had people who legitimately need Medicaid coming to ask me these questions. I had Nicole from my district saying, hey, I need to make sure that these are around for me because I am disabled. And so I was able to actually dispel a lot of the fear-mongering and misinformation out there about these benefit changes. And so I think that the Democrats' fear-mongering is the real problem here.
But, Congresswoman, it's not just Democrats. There are Republican United States senators who also have concerns about these cuts for Medicaid and are pushing for changes to the bill as a result. Is there any changes they could make that would make you a hard no when it returns to the House?
Well, I think the Republican senators probably are looking at all of the details right now of how many illegal immigrants we're removing from this bill. 1.4 million illegal immigrants getting health care. I'm pretty sure they support getting them off the health care rolls. I think they probably also support making sure that we don't have people who are enrolled in 2 states getting Medicaid benefits. And I'm pretty sure that they also support making sure that able-bodied adults are the ones who are actually in the workforce if you're going to be receiving a government benefit. I think most Americans also agree that we should make sure that policy is in place. So I think that we'll be willing to have conversations with our Senate colleagues about this big, beautiful bill. But it is of utmost importance that we make some of these changes to Medicaid for the program long term, because this is about preserving benefits for the people who actually need them, not making cuts. Again, I think most people can agree people who can work should be working.
It sounds like you don't really see many changes coming from the upper chamber, Congresswoman. I don't know if I'm right about what I'm hearing from you, but do you expect that this bill comes back in similar shape that you sent it?
Well, I think so. And I think ultimately, I've had conversations with many of my colleagues in the Senate. We all want to make sure we're executing on President Trump's agenda, making sure we're providing tax relief for hardworking Americans. Again, the fear-mongering that's out there about this bill, I think it is driving a lot of the conversation about making changes. And I heard Senator Cramer just a few minutes ago. Well, I don't think
Republican senators are fear-mongering about deeper cuts, though, right? If they want deeper spending, isn't that something you'd support?
Yeah. I want to get the most conservative bill passed that we can get consensus on, and that's what I will continue to support. So as we continue to have those conversations with our Senate colleagues, we do have a very narrow majority in the House, and I think everybody saw the conversations that we had to have with some of our members who maybe had a little bit of disagreement as well about how much to cut, or maybe thought it was cutting too much. So I think we, again, hit that really sweet spot in getting that bill passed, and I look forward to continuing those conversations. And hopefully in the future we can do more. Let's prove to the American people that Republicans are the ones who can govern. We're the ones who know what to do with the economy. We know that returning taxpayer dollars to taxpayers is what we should be doing. And we also know that making these changes long term will help to right the direction of our country. This is what President Trump ran on. This is what I ran on. And that is exactly what we have to deliver for the American people.
Well, Congresswoman, you and I both know the president also ran on tariffs, and given your seat on the China Select Committee, I do want to ask you about the accusations the U.S. and China are now trading, each saying that the other has violated the agreement struck in Geneva. President Trump and Xi Jinping potentially could speak by phone this week. Is China a credible actor in these negotiations?
Well, I think those allegations are categorically false, but I think the most important thing is that we get to a good deal, a deal that's enforceable with China. I'm hearing from Iowans every single day. We want to make sure that we have access to markets, and China is an important market for our farmers and our manufacturers in Iowa. But at the end of the day, we need to realize, eyes wide open, that China can't be trusted. They're looking for every loophole, and they've worked around every single policy that we've put into place. I believe in strong enforcement of tariffs and duties, and so I'm working on legislation that will also help to make sure our Department of Justice can go after the bad actors who are trying to cheat. And so that's the mindset that I would go into in any conversation with President Xi. And I know President Trump's the one to get that deal done. He's a master deal maker, as we know.
All right, Congresswoman, great to have you back on Balance of Power. Joining us from Bloomberg's global headquarters in New York, Republican Congresswoman Ashley Hinson of Iowa. We appreciate it. And coming up, the fallout from President Trump's steel and aluminum tariff announcement and what it means for those ongoing trade deal negotiations.
But first, Russia and Ukraine wrapping up their latest direct peace talks in Istanbul a day after Kyiv staged one of its boldest aerial attacks deep inside Russia, destroying long-range bombers and other aircraft. We'll discuss what this means for peace negotiations next. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Alongside Joe Mathieu, I'm Kailey Leinz. Russia and Ukraine held their latest direct peace talks in Istanbul today, with the two sides exchanging documents and preparing for another prisoner exchange. But this was held just after Ukraine staged a bold aerial attack inside Russia, destroying long-range bombers and other aircraft. And joining us now with the latest is Bloomberg's Greg White, here with us in our Washington, D.C. studio. So, Greg, obviously this was a kind of show of covert force for Ukraine. How did it change the nature of the conversations that were had today?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a really remarkable asymmetric strike by the Ukrainian forces. According to their account, they smuggled drones into the country and were able to launch them from close to these bases, strategic bombers that can also carry nuclear weapons, so deep, thousands of miles deep inside Russian territory. And according to the Ukrainian accounts, and some of which have been confirmed by the allies, that destroying at least a couple of the planes. So that's really a big boost for Ukrainian morale, and so at a time when the Russians have been arguing that time is on their side, and that this is going to that they have all the cards, and that's a line we've heard also from the White House for Kiev to show that they actually are able to pull off this sort of a daring attack is really a big boost on that side.
Incredible to see. If you saw this in a movie, you would think it was impossible. They worked on this for over a year, apparently, to get this many drones. They smuggled over 100 drones into Russia. That would suggest there could be a lot more where those came from. Is Ukraine capable of another strike like this?
It's hard to know. I mean, they've done they've adapted tactics over the course of the war. They said for a while they were doing relatively long-range strikes with their own drones flying from Ukraine, but then Russia got pretty good at shooting those down. And so this is a kind of new twist, and whether they'll be able to pull this off, again, obviously the logistics are quite challenging, but it definitely shows a weakness in the Russian defenses.
We just have 30 seconds left, Greg, but will there be another round of talks between Ukraine and Russia after today?
So the Ukrainians said that they're going to look at the Russian proposal, which they first saw today, which seems very far from their own. And there was talk about a possibility of a meeting later this month, but it looks like nothing so far has been set.
Boy, we've got a long way to go, it sounds like. Bloomberg's Greg White, thank you for the update. After a remarkable weekend, Kailey, this is the type of thing that we never thought we would see from Ukraine this deep into Russia. They hit a target in Siberia.
Yeah, a military target specifically, of course, also coming as Russia over the weekend hit more civilian targets inside Ukraine.
Pretty remarkable. And we'll have much more on this coming up. We'll continue the conversation on the latest between Russia and Ukraine. Hagar Chemali of Greenwich Media Strategies is up next with myself and Kailey on Balance of Power. This is Bloomberg TV and radio.
are going to be imposing a 25% increase. We're going to bring it from 25% to 50%, the tariffs on steel into the United States of America, which will even further secure the steel industry in the United States. Nobody's going to get around that.
President Trump at a U.S. steel facility in Pennsylvania on Friday announcing a doubling of steel and aluminum tariffs, which threatens to increase the cost of critical building materials. For more here on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio, let's turn now to Bloomberg's Catherine Lucey. And Catherine, indeed, we saw futures for steel and aluminum spiking today, but we also saw a big boost for shares of U.S. based steel companies like Nucor, for example. And the president is arguing that for whatever potential higher input costs some businesses could face, this is still good for the industry.
Right. He's arguing this is good for U.S. steel and good for U.S. workers. Obviously, there is a push-pull with these things where these are complicated global equations, right? Mm-hmm. You also saw today that European officials are threatening that this could be problematic for negotiations on a trade deal with the EU. And so there could be real implications here if this goes forward.
This announcement came Friday. In fact, we were carrying Donald Trump's speech from outside Pittsburgh that we just saw a piece of. It was pretty deep in the speech, which surprised us that this wasn't a headline announcement as soon as the president got to the podium. Would that suggest that it may not be permanent? What do we make of the timing?
You know, Trump is always going to do things his way. Sometimes honestly, I think sometimes he likes to build up to things. Yeah. So it could be as simple as that,
but
quite
honestly. But the timing in terms of now, why double it now?
One, I think he wanted to get out in front of workers in Pittsburgh. He wanted to have something to deliver there. And Trump always takes sort of a maximalist or like a big approach to these negotiations. So if he feels like things aren't moving as quickly as he wants to with other countries, with these tariff talks, he feels like going big can sometimes force people back to the table or force progress. So some of that thinking is injected into a lot of these announcements.
Sure.
Well, certainly the president is of the mind that things are not progressing in the right direction when it comes to negotiations with China specifically. And we heard from the White House press secretary Caroline Leavitt about that earlier today.
I can confirm that the two leaders will likely talk this week. And as always, when there are foreign leader calls, we will provide a readout of those calls.
The two leaders she's referring to, Catherine, being Xi Jinping and President Trump, both sides having had accused each other of violating the Geneva Agreement in recent days. Is this really going to happen?
The relationship here is not in a great place. Both sides are accusing each other of bad faith for different reasons with what is a pretty fragile detente. And as far as we know, they have not spoken since Trump took office. So if there is a call, that would be a significant step forward. But we really have to wait to see if this actually happens. Trump, I think, is more eager for it to happen. He sees direct negotiations, direct conversation as a way to push this forward. And some of his top officials are saying the same thing. They think that this is what needs to happen for the recent progress here.
Bloomberg's Catherine Lucey. We thank you, Catherine, for the great reporting here on Balance of Power. Here's Senator Michael Bennet earlier today on the Senate floor addressing the attack that took place over the weekend in Boulder, Colorado.
People all over this country and all over the world have marched in solidarity for our hostages. And yesterday, the people in Boulder, Colorado were savagely attacked by a terrorist while they were expressing their First Amendment rights. That should never happen in this country.
Here's what we know. A 45-year-old man was arrested for allegedly throwing an incendiary device into a crowd at a Colorado event supporting Israeli hostages in Gaza, injuring at least 12 people.
The suspect used a makeshift flamethrower, yelling "Free Palestine" during the incident, which the FBI is investigating as a targeted terror attack. 16 unused Molotov cocktails were later recovered from the scene. Today, he was charged with a federal hate crime and 16 counts of attempted murder. The man is a citizen of Egypt and has been living in the U.S. on a visa that expired in 2023.
The incident sparking renewed concern now about anti-Semitic violence here in the U.S. Less than 2 weeks after the two members of the Israeli embassy's staff were killed just outside the Capitol Jewish Museum here in Washington, D.C.
This afternoon, President Trump responded to the incident in a post on Truth Social, saying in part, quote, "Yesterday's horrific attack in Boulder, Colorado will not be tolerated in the United States of America." He goes on to say acts of terrorism will be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law.
We'll continue to bring you updates from this story as it develops. Joining us now with their reaction, Bloomberg Politics contributor Jeannie Sheehan Zaino, senior democracy fellow at the Center for the Study of the Presidency in Congress, and our Democratic analyst tonight, alongside Republican strategist Matt Gorman, executive vice president at Targeted Victory. It's great to see both of you here. Jeannie, we've been talking about this terrible story since the early edition of Balance of Power. Now that you're actually seeing that this could have been worse, unused Molotov cocktails, it does make you wonder what kind of violence could be spreading onto our shores here as this conflict continues in the Middle East.
Absolutely, Joe. And it's been throughout Europe. We've seen incidents at synagogues and at other Jewish community centers in France. We've seen attacks on young Jewish people in London. We've seen these attacks in the last several weeks. You know, everyone from the governor of Pennsylvania to the two young people from the Israeli embassy, and now this horrific attack. So it does seem to be spreading, and it is an enormous concern. You know, the Anti-Defamation League is reporting that incidents of violence and terror against Jewish people or people of Jewish descent in the United States were the highest in five of the last 6 years, were the highest that they'd ever recorded. And that is saying something. And of course, our hearts go out to the poor victims in this attack, which was horrific, and one of whom was a Holocaust survivor.
Well, and that is why, Matt, that this is raising concerns about anti-Semitism. But the president is actually taking this beyond that. The part of the True Social post that we didn't read also suggests this is yet another example of why we must keep our borders secure and deport illegal anti-American radicals from our homeland, given this was someone who had overstayed a visa years previously. Does that risk kind of muddling the wider issue here on anti-Semitism?
There's two issues, I think. Clearly, this jives with his immigration agenda. He should not have been here in the first place. But secondly, I guess what I'm troubled by is we don't see the same sort of reckoning we saw in the summer of 2020 with race that we should be seeing right now with this anti-Semitic violence. I mean, obviously you pointed out the Capitol Jewish Museum murder, but also there is the Josh Shapiro firebombing of the executive mansion in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. These are not one-offs. And, you know, I think it's an incredible state of our society right now that this keeps happening, and we have to have it stop. It's absolutely unacceptable.
Free Palestine was chanted in both of these cases, with the two murders here and with what happened in this case in Boulder. How do politicians need to be talking about this? You're the Republican on our panels. Is Donald Trump setting the model for that here?
It's in two ways, right? Immigration absolutely have placed his strengths. It's a very valid issue, and certainly where he's talking about it, but also Michael Bennett, who's the son of a Holocaust survivor, running for governor of Colorado. He was right on this too, and I think, you know, the middling statements, there's no time for that, and I think both of those have hit the right note on this.
I do want to mention some news that just crossed the terminal, according to Senator Ron Johnson, saying that he spoke with President Trump today. Senator Johnson, of course, being one of those in the upper chamber who have raised concerns about the House-passed tax reconciliation bill that is likely to see changes in the Senate. We spoke about that with Republican Senator Kevin Cramer of North Dakota earlier this hour.
The biggest piece of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act from 2017 that we need to fix is to make those tax cuts permanent. Those are pro-growth tax cuts, and if we want to make a dynamic economy even more dynamic, I think that's got to be sort of the foundation of it all. So it will look largely the same, but I think some of the numbers will change.
Some of the numbers will change, Jeannie. We're just wondering if they might change in a deal-breaking way for the House. How drastic could these Senate changes realistically become?
Yeah, I mean, they're going to have to try to keep them in line with something that can pass muster in a very thin margin in the House. And that's going to be the challenge here. And, you know, so far, and it's fascinating to hear Ron Johnson talking to the president, because so far there are enough deficit hawks on the Republican side in the Senate to stop this bill without substantive changes. Now, I think in the end they will get those changes. I think this will pass the House and the Senate at some point. But then you're going to have a Republican Party that has to go out and sell this bill to the American public. And what are they going to be facing? They're going to be facing pictures of Elon Musk with a chainsaw talking about cutting people from the federal government while they are cutting Medicaid for people in their own districts and states, children and elderly people. It's going to be a very, very tough sell, which is why these deficit hawks, in a way, are doing them a favor by putting this concern up front. And by the way, on the deficit, it pocks on both of the houses, both Democrat and Republican, because nobody has been responsible on this, and this bill is not responsible on it.
Well, that's sounding like Ron Johnson, Jeannie. He says Donald Trump pressed him to support the tax bill. But when you step back and look at this, Matt, you've been through a couple of these. Ron Johnson's got something in common with Mike Crapo's got something in common with Mike Lee's got something in common with Tom Tillis.
Yep.
You've got a lot of arms to twist here. Is this how it's done? Phone calls from the president?
We're in the posturing phase right now.
Okay.
No one's going to want to be seen to be taking this at face value from the House. But the political reality is this. There's a much thinner margin in the House than it is in the Senate. So this is going to have to look a lot more like the House version than whatever the Senate people have in their dreams. That's just the political reality of this. Because, frankly, if they can't pass anything, then everybody loses on this. And I think that is the Senate doesn't want to be seen as taking this outright from the House. I understand there might be a little bit of hierarchy there in their minds. But at the end of the day, it's going to look a lot more like what Mike Johnson wants than what the Senate wants.
Considering Mike Johnson has members in states like New York who could make or break his majority in 2026. But I also want to talk about the state of New York, not for a House electoral reason, but for the gubernatorial race. Jeannie, you're obviously up in New York, where we've just gotten news that New York's lieutenant governor is going to challenge in the primary Governor Kathy Hochul. The quote from that Lieutenant Governor, Antonio Delgado, says people are hurting and New York deserves better leadership. What does that say to you, Jeannie?
It is just fascinating. I am not surprised. I think we saw this coming. Kathy Hochul has struggled. She is not particularly popular. And you do see a contingent of Democrats saying we need to go in another direction if we are going to retain the gubernatorial seat, the governorship here. And of course, they can have a formidable Republican challenge on their hands, whether it is, one of the representatives from New York. We've heard a lot about maybe a Mike Lawler or somebody else, or Elise Stefanik. I mean, there's a bunch of people on the Republican side. So this is going to be a hard-fought race. And of course, we also have the mayor's race coming up in New York City. And I mention that only because the leader on the Democratic side there is Andrew Cuomo, who used to be governor of New York. And I was really hoping to see him and Kathy Hochul re-established together, which would have been fascinating, but it won't happen.
There's just nothing like New York politics. That's why Jeannie's here. Look, I guess this is a gift for Republicans. What do you do, though, if you're a governor and the call's coming from inside the House?
I mean, this speech says more about Kathy Hochul's weakness than Antonio Delgado's strength. I mean, she has the political acumen of this desk. She's always been a bad candidate. But look, Antonio Delgado's an ambitious guy. He won his seat in Congress when I was at the NRCC. He shouldn't be underestimated. But Jeannie's exactly right. The New York mayoral race between Zora Mandani and then Andrew Cuomo is subtly also having a lot of juice in a way that I think a lot of folks didn't expect either. Mandani could sneak out at least a victory in the primary.
Well, that's one of the races that we'll be watching ahead. Another race we're going to be watching in 2026 that arguably you would think would be a senator that would be seen as safe is Senator Joni Ernst, who's up for re-election in Iowa after having in a town hall this weekend when pressed about whether or not there was a risk to people's lives due to SNAP and Medicaid cuts, said we're all going to die, and then seemed to double down on it in a social media post in the graveyard that we all need to kind of come to terms with our own mortality. Do you think that's the right strategy here, Matt?
It was a joke, certainly. But I think one of the things, Joni is pretty talented politically. We're far off away from Election Day. And it's also, she won her seat. In large part to Bruce Braley's comments that were caught on video back in 2014 that were unfortunate. But I think she should easily come back from this. J.D. Schultz is running against her as a Democrat. He's been in the state legislature a little while. She's pretty talented. I don't worry about Joni. I worry about a lot of other people, not Joni's.
I don't know. Are we making too big a deal out of this, Jeannie? This is the age of Trump. You don't apologize for something. You make your critics look ridiculous, right?
Well, you try, but it's awfully hard to sort of parrot and do what Donald Trump does. And for me, the video, the folk apology fell really, really flat. I do think she's a good politician. She hasn't been displaying that in the last few days. And of course, the reality is Joni Ernst was under attack not that long ago from the far MAGA right in terms of the Pete Hegseth nomination. And so she's feeling the heat and she's responding.
All right, Jeannie Shanzano, Matt Gorman, great analysis and a great panel. Thank you for the conversation.
And there's another story we're watching tonight, Joe, following Poland's presidential election. The victory going to nationalist candidate Karol Nawrocki, complicating efforts to shift the nation back into the European Union mainstream. Nawrocki won 50.9% in Sunday's ballot, according to the results released by the Electoral Commission early Monday.
The election outcome may add to elevated instability in an increasingly fraught geopolitical environment, with the country's prime minister now, Donald Tusk, seeking for a vote of confidence to shore up support for his coalition government. Tusk is aiming to reestablish unity in the cabinet and has an emergency plan in case of difficult cooperation. His words with the new president, Karol Nawrocki.
The ascent of the conservative historian and one-time boxer with scant political experience also marks a rare win for Trump's MAGA movement abroad. We'll continue to follow his new role and how it will impact relations between the U.S. and the EU moving forward. But still ahead, we'll revisit the conversation on the latest between Russia and Ukraine. More of that next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
We saw credible evidence of a summer, early fall invasion, a new offensive by Putin. He's playing the game at the peace table. He's preparing for more war.
Putin is playing President Trump. He's taking him for a sucker. He is, in effect, stalling and stonewalling, prolonging the conversation so that he can mount this offensive and take control of more territory on the ground.
Democratic Senator Richard Blumenthal there, along with Republican Senator Lindsey Graham, speaking after a visit to Ukraine over the weekend. The pair also urging the U.S. and Europe to take steps to stop China and India from purchasing cheap Russian oil, with Senator Graham now aiming to have new sanctions imposed on Russia before the G7 summit in late June. For more, we turn to Hagar Chemali, the CEO and founder of Greenwich Media Strategies, former director for Syria and Lebanon on the National Security Council in the Obama administration. Hagar, it's always great to see you. Welcome back to Bloomberg. I know I'm supposed to ask you about sanctions against Russia, but after what we saw over the weekend, the resourcefulness and the cleverness to execute a mission like that, Ukraine striking deep inside Russia, if that had been going on the last couple of years, would we even need sanctions?
It's remarkable what they did, right? I mean, the sheer creativity and genius of that attack that they had been planning apparently for 18 months. They called it Operation Spider Web, I believe, or Spider something, where they smuggled in drones into Russia through trucks, and then these roofs opened up and the drones flew out and struck these air bases. And the importance of that is that there are restrictions on U.S. and European weapons that go to Ukraine in terms of how they're used inside Russian territory. And the Ukrainians showed yet again that they can be very creative, very scrappy, and very lethal. And they're certainly trying to fight this war as smart as they can. But to answer your question as to whether we would have needed sanctions, yes. I mean, you know, I'm a sanctions lover. And so I do believe that sanctions are important still in undermining this extent to which Putin can finance his war machine.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it is what Putin might do next that I want to ask you about, Hagar, because today on the early edition of Balance of Power, we spoke with Kelly Grieco, a senior fellow at the Reimagining U.S. Grand Strategy program at the Stimson Center. And this is what she had to say about Russia's potential response, specifically what she wouldn't rule out.
I don't think Russia's going to use a nuclear asset in response to this, but I can't totally rule it out. I think it's worth saying, and that, gives me pause that I'm even having to say that. I think they're going to look, though, for something that is very visible. And I think signaling not just to the Ukrainians, but I think at this point they're going to want to signal to the United States and even China, that its nuclear arsenal is not vulnerable, that it's able to still operate effectively.
It gave us pause as well, Hagar, when she said that. Do you agree with her?
Well, I mean, to be honest with you, for the last 2 years, Putin has been playing that nuclear card. He's been publicly saying, anytime he feels desperate or cornered, he does say publicly, oh, well, I have these tactical nuclear weapons that I could easily use in Ukraine. And he doesn't. And that doesn't mean he's bluffing. He's not somebody that I would just assume is bluffing, because that's dangerous and would be naive. But at the same time, he's not an idiot. And he knows what using his nuclear weapons would mean, and that it would elevate this to a whole other level. And he is, and we need to remember this, that both sides are trying to still actively appease Trump. That's why they're even involved in peace talks. Otherwise, they wouldn't be right now. Both of them are still at it, to be honest with you. And Ukraine is there because they don't want to lose their aid, and Putin is there because he wants to maintain this positive relationship with Trump, and he doesn't want to face additional sanctions, which is a threat he takes seriously. But if he were to use nuclear weapons in Ukraine, then any relationship he has with Trump is off the table. So I don't want to say it's not a threat to be taken seriously. Of course it is, but I also wouldn't jump to that conclusion so quickly. That said, Putin will respond in a tough and strong manner.
So that's going to happen. We're going to be talking about it at some point, if you're right, in the days ahead. Hagar, when you consider the talks that were held today in Turkey, the events of this weekend, what you just predicted, are we moving further away from or closer to peace?
So here's the things that I would look for in these peace talks. I would not expect any major breakthroughs, certainly not a negotiated end to this war. But there are small things that you could look forward to. For example, another prisoner swap. That's what you got out of the last time they had talks. Potentially just a promise to continue those talks. Or, for example, one of the things that Ukrainians have put forward is a direct meeting between Zelensky and Putin. So there are small steps that could come out of these talks. That's the type of those are the type of deliverables I would look for, but I wouldn't expect anything major at all.
What about your expectations around the proposal that has been put forward by the U.S. to Hamas and Israel for cessation of hostilities there, Hagar? We know there has been some pushback from Hamas. Steve Witkoff has called Hamas's response unacceptable. Is this also just an effort that will yield little?
So I'm glad you asked me about this, because we're going to rinse and repeat this a few times, to be honest with you. And the reason is that you've got three different parties with three completely different conflicting goals. And as a result, I expect multiple rounds of proposed ceasefires that don't end up happening. And the reason is that on the Israeli side, Netanyahu's goal is to obliterate Hamas completely, no matter what. And try and release the hostages in the process, but he wants to see Hamas obliterated at any cost. On Hamas's end, they're just trying to survive. They want to maintain some kind of weaponry, perhaps the potential for governing again. But most importantly, they don't want to touch their weapons, and that is a complete red line for Netanyahu. And on the U.S. side, the goal, frankly, has been the same as it was under Biden, which is a general end to the war, humanitarian aid going in, and the release of hostages. And that's why the U.S. continues to push these proposals, and why Israel accepts the idea of a temporary ceasefire, because that's how they can at least get the hostages back. But they're not willing to negotiate an end to the war because it's not in their cards, and Hamas won't negotiate without that as part of it. So they're going to keep pressuring Hamas more and more. So sorry to give you the down and dirty of it, but I don't have a lot of optimism for this, unfortunately.
Well, that's why we come to you, Hagar. We appreciate it as always. Hagar Chemali, CEO and founder of Greenwich Media Strategies, of course, also formerly with the National Security Council. Thank you so much. And as we continue to follow geopolitics, we'll be following domestic politics as well. As the Senate is back on Capitol Hill, we're learning some senators have had conversations with President Trump about this big tax bill. The Majority Leader, John Thune, yes, but also holdouts like Ron Johnson.
Yeah, the phone's already ringing. This is going to be an interesting week as we work our way to the jobs report on Friday, with a lot on the line here for Donald Trump and his reconciliation bill.
And of course, you can find more coverage of it in the Washington Edition newsletter, on the terminal and online. And we'll see you back here tomorrow on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.